So in California, it's important to understand that there's two types of spousal support. One is temporary spousal support and one is permanent spousal support. And I do permanent with quotations for a reason. Temporary spousal support is what is my support while the divorce is pending, while your divorce is going on. And that's really just a calculation. You plug in numbers of what the current circumstances are between what you're earning in terms of income or if you're not earning any income. Basically, temporary spousal support is simply a calculation of what the current circumstances are. Permanent support, and I use that, it's really what's in your final divorce judgment or decree. And what that means is it's not a calculation. It's an analysis of what your marital standard of living was. So it's more of a factual analysis of the type of cars you drove during the marriage, the type of house you lived, how big the house is, that kind of thing, type of vacations you took, and so on. And then there's factors under the family code in California about what the court has to consider. If you go to court for trial for that, that has to be dealt with and addressed all factually for all those factors on that. If you're trying to settle out of court, we try to resolve that by looking at what the temporary support orders are. And if somebody's not employed, we might impute an income to him or her that's fair to work out some kind of resolution out of court. So it's much more involved than what a temporary support calculation is, but it's all what needs to be addressed. For consideration of spousal support, the court has to look at what your marital standard of living was. So it's the type of cars you drove, home you lived in, vacations you took, you name it. But basically it's what kind of life was the family living during the time, as well as the court has to look at things like the age, health, and needs of the parties, whether there was any domestic violence involved, whether one spouse has been more of a stay-at-home parent for different reasons, and maybe that person helped contribute to the career of the other spouse. There's about 10 different factors that the court has to consider in order to really address what is a fair resolution of spousal support. What, in light of the marriage, what happened in the marriage, what is fair in coming up with a support order for spousal support that is appropriate under the circumstances of your case. In California, you can modify spousal support after your divorce is final, depending on the circumstances. If one party loses their job, that's generally going to justify modification of the support because they're not going to be able to pay what they were ordered to pay if they've lost their job, or through no fault of their own, they've had to take a reduction of income. If somebody was not working during the marriage and then they got a job, that's another grounds for a change of circumstances to justify modification of support. It's also important to understand that in California, there's something called a short-term marriage and a long-term marriage. Short-term marriage is a marriage under 10 years. Long-term marriage is anything over 10 years. So for a short-term marriage, that means spousal support is usually going to be for half the length of the marriage. But if it's a long-term marriage over 10 years, and the further you get away from 10 years, the more you get to 15, 20 years, it's going to be difficult to terminate that. But things can happen like that where somebody gets remarried. That's generally going to terminate the spousal support. Or somebody's going to turn 65 and retire. That's a justification to modify or terminate the support. So there are different bases in which to modify the support in California. In California, spousal support is pretty common. I'd say at least in 60-70% of cases, I generally see spousal support as being ordered or agreed to. Again, because somebody simply was more of the breadwinner. That could be the wife or the husband in this day and age. It depends on what somebody was making. Where it's not generally going to happen is if the parties make comparable income. I'd say on average, if somebody's making 10, 20, 30, maybe even $40,000 difference between each other in terms of income, generally there's not going to be any spousal support. Oftentimes, if it's a very short-term marriage, spousal support is generally not ordered for more than a short period of time. If you have any further questions about spousal support issues, feel free to contact the Maggio Law firm.